He said, I have signed all the other actors, and they're all in the pilot, and you were not, and you will have to be in last position. I said, well, I'm not going to be very comfortable with that. Then he turned to the casting man, who was also in the office, and he said, sign him up, and don't pay him too much money.
When most people remember Lost in Space, they picture the colorful Jupiter 2, the Robinson family, Dr. Smith, and the robots shouting warnings about danger. But behind that familiar image was a very different side of the series. And one episode in particular became so controversial that some television stations simply chose not to show it. By the third season, Lost in Space had already transformed from the tense survival adventure it had been in its early days into something much more colorful and theatrical, with strange planets, eccentric villains, cosmic warriors, and increasingly wild stories. Then came an episode called Castles in Space. On the surface, it sounded like another exciting Robinson family adventure. The story placed the crew on a freezing, desolate planet and introduced an ice princess who had been trapped in suspended animation. After Dr. Smith accidentally awakened her, she became the target of a ruthless, silver-skinned bounty hunter named Chavo. The episode promised frozen fortresses, laser battles, and a classic space adventure. But once television executives saw what had actually been filmed, the story took a very different turn. The biggest problem was not the alien planet or the action. It was Chavo himself. The character was played by Alberto Mani and was portrayed as an exaggerated bandito figure, complete with an accent, flamboyant behavior, and characteristics that reflected ethnic stereotypes. The portrayal was considered deeply insensitive by some local television executives, and one particular moment made the situation even stranger. Chavo gets the robot drunk on tequila in an attempt to obtain information from him. What might have been intended as absurd comic entertainment instead became a serious problem for stations responsible for deciding what their audiences would see. In several major television markets, local affiliates reportedly decided that the episode was too inappropriate to broadcast. Rather than airing the scheduled Lost in Space adventure, they substituted other programming, including movies, sports reruns, or local news. Viewers who expected to see the Robinson family could suddenly find something completely different on their screens, or an episode missing from the schedule altogether. The controversy did not simply disappear after the original broadcast period. According to the source material, the episode was later flagged during syndication, and when local stations purchased packages of Lost in Space reruns for afternoon television, Castles in Space was frequently skipped or removed from the rotation. The reason was simple. Programmers did not want to invite another wave of complaints over the controversial portrayal. Eventually, the episode became an example of something that happened frequently in older television but is easy to forget today. A program could be produced, recorded, and even included in network records, yet still become effectively invisible because local broadcasters decided that showing it was not worth the controversy. Castles in Space was therefore more than another bizarre chapter in the Robinson family's journey. It showed how quickly the cultural standards surrounding a popular family program could change, and how a character created for entertainment could eventually become the very reason an episode was pushed aside. And the strange thing is, this was only the beginning. Because if an offensive character portrayal could cause broadcasters to pull an episode from circulation, what happened when the problem was not one character, but an entire version of Lost in Space that the network itself decided was too dark to put on television? The second story takes us back to the very beginning, before Lost in Space had become the colorful science fiction adventure audiences eventually knew. In 1965, producer Irwin Allen had already spent an enormous amount of money creating the original pilot, a production titled No Place to Hide. For the television industry of the time, the reported $600,000 cost was an extraordinary gamble, representing a huge investment in a series that had not even been proven with an audience. Allen had poured money into elaborate sets, miniature spacecraft, matte paintings, mechanical effects, and action sequences, creating a version of Lost in Space that looked and felt dramatically different from the show that eventually reached millions of homes. This original pilot was designed as a serious survival story. Instead of the lighter, more theatrical adventures that would later define the series, It focused on a family traveling through space on a dangerous mission to colonize a distant world in the Alpha Centauri system. Their spacecraft, the Gemini 12, is knocked off course by a rogue meteor shower, leaving the family stranded on an unknown alien planet filled with dangerous conditions, freezing temperatures, and enormous cyclopes-like creatures. The concept was straightforward: a family against an unforgiving universe. But when network executives watched the expensive footage, they apparently saw a major problem. The pilot was too serious, too technical, and too emotionally distant for the kind of primetime family entertainment they wanted. More importantly, two characters that would eventually become central to Lost in Space were missing from this original version. There was no Dr. Smith, and there was no robot. Without a villain to create conflict, and without the mechanical companion that would eventually provide warmth, humor, and personality, executives feared the show would feel bleak and frightening rather than entertaining for families. Instead of simply accepting the pilot or throwing away the enormous investment, the network demanded major changes. Allen was ordered to return to production, restructure the premise, and introduce both a saboteur and a mechanical companion. The original pilot was pulled from broadcast plans and kept away from the public for decades. Parts of the original material were later reworked, re-edited, and combined with newly filmed scenes to create the much lighter version of the series that audiences eventually saw. That decision completely changed the direction of Lost in Space. The serious survival drama that existed in No Place to Hide was replaced by a more character-driven adventure, and the darker original vision disappeared from ordinary television history for years. Then came Dr. Zachary Smith. In the newly filmed premiere, The Reluctant Stowaway, Smith was initially designed as a dangerous saboteur, a calculating operative whose actions were intended to destroy the mission from within. His original characterization was much darker than the cowardly, theatrical figure audiences would eventually love to hate. He was supposed to be ruthless, dangerous, and potentially disposable once his sabotage had served its purpose. But Jonathan Harris changed everything. During filming, Harris began performing Smith in a far more theatrical and eccentric way, moving away from the cold, menacing personality originally envisioned and creating the pompous, cowardly character who would become one of the show's defining figures. His interactions with the robot became comedic instead of purely threatening, and his insults and exaggerated behavior gave producers something they had not originally planned for. Instead of becoming a short-lived villain, Smith became one of the central personalities of the entire series. The darker material surrounding him was softened through re-editing, and scenes that presented him as an irredeemable killer were removed or altered. In the end, the network's attempt to create a serious science fiction survival series had unintentionally produced something very different. The original dark pilot was buried, the sinister version of Dr. Smith was softened, and Lost in Space moved toward the colorful, theatrical style that would eventually define its identity. What makes these stories fascinating is that the version of Lost in Space that became famous was not necessarily the version that was first imagined. Some of its most recognizable elements were created because executives rejected what came before, while other material was pushed aside because broadcasters believed it would create problems. The result was a series shaped not only by what audiences watched, but also by what networks decided audiences should never see. But the story of the lost material surrounding Lost in Space did not end with the original pilot. Once the network had decided that the series needed a stronger antagonist and a more recognizable identity, Dr. Zachary Smith became the unexpected center of attention. In the original concept, Smith was supposed to be a genuinely dangerous figure, a saboteur whose actions threatened the entire mission. He had been tasked with programming the environmental control robot to destroy the ship's guidance systems shortly after launch, only for his own plan to backfire and leave him trapped aboard the departing spacecraft. That version of Smith was cold, calculating, and potentially lethal. But Jonathan Harris understood that a character like that might not survive for long on a family television show. If Smith remained nothing more than a murderous villain, the Robinsons would eventually have to get rid of him. Harris therefore began reshaping the character through his performance, replacing the menacing personality with something far more theatrical, cowardly, and self-important. He began experimenting with exaggerated delivery and improvised insults toward the robot, turning what could have been deadly confrontations into comic exchanges. When producers saw the footage, they realized that Harris had accidentally created something much more valuable than the villain they originally requested. Smith was no longer simply someone the audience was supposed to fear. He was becoming someone they wanted to watch. That unexpected transformation forced the production to change direction again. Darker dialogue was removed or altered, and scenes that made Smith appear completely ruthless were softened. The final broadcast version, therefore, presented a character very different from the dangerous saboteur found in the earlier concept. The decision proved enormously important because Smith's relationship with Will Robinson and the robot would eventually become one of the defining dynamics of Lost in Space. Instead of remaining a straightforward survival drama, the series increasingly became a character-driven adventure built around the strange relationship between a young boy, a mechanical companion, and a selfish, scheming doctor. This change also helped prepare the show for an even bigger transformation. When Lost in Space first arrived on television in 1965, it was launched during a period when public fascination with space exploration was reaching extraordinary levels. Real-world NASA missions were dominating headlines, and audiences were fascinated by the possibility of humanity traveling beyond Earth. Irwin Allen recognized the opportunity and created a series that looked enormous by television standards. The production used detailed miniature spacecraft, elaborate sets, visual effects, and alien environments that gave the show a cinematic appearance. The first season was filmed in black and white and retained much of the tense atmosphere associated with the show's original concept. The Robinson family faced dangerous environments, strange creatures, and the constant uncertainty of being stranded far from Earth. But television trends were changing rapidly, and one of the biggest influences was ABC's Batman. When Batman exploded onto the television landscape with its bright colors, exaggerated performances, and campy humor, networks began reconsidering what audiences wanted from their entertainment. Lost in Space responded by changing dramatically in its second season. The series moved into Technicolor, and the visual world became brighter, louder, and increasingly strange. The survival-focused atmosphere gave way to colorful costumes, theatrical villains, unusual planets, and stories that could be much more playful. This was the version of Lost in Space that eventually became most familiar to viewers, but the transformation came at a price. Critics who remembered the darker tone of the first season increasingly viewed the later episodes as excessive and silly. They saw the colorful adventures, bizarre creatures, space pirates, and theatrical villains as evidence that the series had abandoned serious science fiction. Yet audiences continued watching. Families were not necessarily interested in scientific realism. They wanted adventure, imagination, humor, and characters they could return to every week. At the center of that experience were Dr. Smith, Will Robinson, and the robot. The contrast between Will's intelligence and innocence, Smith's cowardice and endless schemes, and the robot's protective personality gave the series a distinctive identity that the original pilot had never possessed. The very elements that executives had originally considered necessary to make the show more accessible eventually became the reason the series remained memorable. And that brings us back to the idea of lost or suppressed episodes. What disappeared from the public was not always an entire episode in the same way. Sometimes it was an early version of a story, sometimes a controversial broadcast, and sometimes material that was changed before audiences ever had a chance to see it in its original form. The source material describes Castles in Space as an episode that was skipped by some local stations during syndication because of concerns surrounding its portrayal of Chavo. It describes No Place to Hide as the original pilot that was rejected and kept away from public view for decades. And it describes the darker conception of the reluctant stowaway as material that was heavily softened before the final version reached audiences. Together, these stories reveal something fascinating about television history. Lost in Space was not simply shaped by the stories that made it onto the screen. It was also shaped by the stories, characters, and versions that executives decided were too risky, too dark, too controversial, or simply too different for what they wanted the audience to see. By the time the series ended its 3-season run, it had traveled an extraordinary distance from the serious survival drama imagined at the beginning. It had become a colorful science fiction phenomenon, criticized by some reviewers, but embraced by families who saw it as imaginative entertainment. Its episodes later found new life in syndicated reruns, introducing the Robinson family, Dr. Smith, and the robot to new generations. But behind that familiar legacy remained a strange history of material that had been altered, rejected, skipped, or buried. And perhaps that is the most interesting part of all. The Lost in Space remembered by millions was not created in a single moment. It was assembled through a series of decisions, rewrites, re-edits, performances, and network demands. Some of the show's most important changes happened precisely because someone behind the scenes decided that the original version could not remain as it was. So when viewers look back at Lost in Space today and see the colorful Jupiter 2, the dramatic warnings from the robot, and Dr. Smith's theatrical schemes, they're seeing the final result of a production history filled with versions that could have taken the series in a completely different direction. The lost material tells us what the show might have been, while the surviving series shows what television executives, performers, and audiences ultimately decided it should become.